One of my friends here in France loves coffee, probably more than I do even, so I really wanted to make a super coffee infused tiramisu inspired macaron. I am going to start off by making a biscuit de la cuillère, or the kind of biscuit cookie cake thing that you find in most tiramisu. It is really easy to make if you've never made it before. I am using this recipe in a cookbook that I was gifted last week when I first got to France, and you just start off by whipping up some egg whites with sugar to create kind of a medium peak meringue. And then after that peak has formed, you have really fluffy egg whites, a really nice meringue. You will fold in the egg yolks and then the dry ingredients. That is it. Like, seriously, it is very easy. It is super light and fluffy. You can pipe them the more traditional way that you might usually see, or you can spread it out on a silpat and then cut it out using a cookie cutter. Really, whatever works for you is fine. Just know that this is going inside a macaron, so when we get to piping, we'll want to use a relatively small piping tip so you don't have these ginormous things that you have to cut down. Has been a hot minute since I've made biscuit à la cuillère, and so I was a little bit awkward at piping, so please excuse the lack of piping skills I'm using on this tray. But when I'm piping something like this in a line, I like to kind of go up and back. And then with this kind of sponge, all you need is some powdered sugar. I just have it in a tiny tea strainer because that's what I have available, but you can use any kind of sifter, and just dust lightly the powdered sugar over the sponge, and then about 5 minutes later do that again. This just really helps with the baking process and the texture and whatever. And as I mentioned, you can also just spread out your sponge batter if you don't want to worry about piping and you just want to cut out circles later. So do whatever works for you. I'm just gonna get these into my oven, bake them up, and then while those are cooling and baking, I'm gonna get started on my macarons. But let me first show you just the inside texture. They're seriously so light and fluffy. If you buy Ladyfingers at the store, they are usually really crunchy and weird, and you need to drench them in liquid to soften them up. But trust me, making them at home is way better. So I'm just going to jump over into my macarons. I'm doing the same thing I always do, with the exception of I am going to dust on some cocoa powder at the end before baking. But otherwise, everything is exactly the same as always. I am using the French method here, room temperature egg whites and sugar that I will start streaming in once that looks frothy. And then I will continue to whip that until it gets to a really nice stiff peak. And then I will fold in my dry ingredients and continue the macaronage process. Here in this video today, I want to focus more on the idea and the flavors than technique, so I will let you just watch this until it's time to pipe. Now that I've reached that ribbon stage, I have all of my macaron batter in my piping bag and I have that cocoa powder at the ready. You can use any kind of sifting tool to get the cocoa powder onto your macarons. Just make sure that it has a really fine mesh so that you don't drop all kinds of blobs of cocoa powder that will look really weird, and also you might end up having some macarons bake weird if there are tons of blobs of cocoa powder. I am just going to tap my tray first so the cocoa powder doesn't go flying everywhere. So I will tap my trays, then sprinkle that cocoa powder right away. Again, kind of like with sprinkles, if you were to wait, the higher risk you have of it not sticking, and what would even be the point of doing this if it didn't stick to the shells? I really wanted to dust my cocoa powder on because I wanted to have the look of tiramisu, not just the taste of tiramisu. But if you wanted to, you could also do a cocoa powder shell. You could also do a coffee shell if you wanted to go even further in the extremely coffee variety of things. I am just going to let these rest on my table here, and then once a skin has formed and I can touch them without pulling away any batter, I'll know it's time to bake. I will get these shells baked up, cooled, and matched, and once they are ready to go, I'm going to start working on my buttercream. have my biscuits à la cuillère, the Ladyfingers, I have my Macaron shells, and I have some coffee, espresso just sitting to the side there as a syrup, and I have my ingredients for a honey mascarpone Swiss meringue. So I substituted out some of the weight of my butter, and I will be adding it in as mascarpone at the very end of this process. And I also substituted out some of my sugar and replaced that with honey, both because I wanted to be a little bit less sweet, like sugary sweet, and I wanted to be a little bit more floral sweet. I thought that fit a little bit better with the vibe of tiramisu, which is why I wanted to go for this honey Swiss meringue. A Swiss meringue buttercream means combining the egg whites and sugar or whatever sweetener you're using in a double boiler over kind of a medium heat until everything is just hot to the touch. Your sugar has dissolved, everything is starting to look frothy, and at that point you can pull it off the heat and whip it up with your hand mixer or transfer it into a stand mixer. At that point, I will whip the egg whites and sugar and honey until it both creates a pretty stiff meringue, and also it has cooled to just above room temperature. I don't want this to be completely cold when I add in my butter, but I also don't want it to be hot. I do not want the butter to melt when it hits the meringue. I'm going to start by adding in the butter about one little piece at a time. That butter is, of course, room temperature. If it is cold, it will do two things. One, it will shock the meringue, and also it will be a lot harder to incorporate. So you're probably going to end up with a weirder texture, or it will be a lot harder and a longer process to make. So once all of the butter is incorporated, I am going to do something that you might think is a little bit weird and shocking. Usually things like buttercream that have obviously a very high fat content, we're trying to avoid adding in a lot of liquid. But because I wanted an extremely intense coffee flavor, I am going to pour in a shot of espresso cooled to room temperature right into my buttercream. And it's going to look weird and gross for a little while as I force it into submission, but after that it will incorporate, I promise, and it will end up with a really smooth, glossy, beautiful texture. And once the espresso is incorporated in, I am going to add in the mascarpone. As soon as that is ready to go, I am just going to dip my biscuits à la cuillère, the Ladyfingers, in espresso. If you want to make like a simple syrup and add espresso or coffee or whatever, you can do that, or just straight up espresso is fine too. You can dip them, you can use a paintbrush or a cooking brush to, brush on the espresso. Whatever works for you in your kitchen is great. So I have the biscuits there that are dipped in the espresso. I have my macaron shells, and now I have my espresso mascarpone Swiss buttercream. I'm going to put everything together. I am just going to set a piece of the biscuit on each of the macaron shells, And then after that is done, I will go through and pipe a double ring of the buttercream around each of them. Yes, you could make a smaller biscuit, and yes, you could do just a single layer of buttercream if that is what your heart is telling you to do. I think that's stupid. I think it is much better to have a really intense flavor and texture differentiation. And I mean, just go for it. I think it's way better to have a larger macaron that really packs a punch flavor-wise than trying to stay with a really small, normal-sized macaron. Anyway, just my 2 cents. These macarons should be refrigerated for 24 hours for that maturation process to complete, just like any other macaron, and then they will be ready to dive into. And let me tell you, they are so delicious. That biscuit in the center is so soft, the espresso flavor is so strong, and of course that little dusting of cocoa powder, just perfection. I really hope you give this recipe a try. If you do, let me know in the comments below or tag me on Instagram. I would love to see your end result. Until next time, I hope you have a wonderful day. Bye.